We're live on YouTube now. Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Amanda Show. So since 2023, Sudan has been at war. And if you followed us on this show for a while, you know that what's going on in Sudan is a very, very important topic that we cover a lot on the show. So today we have one of the most eminent voices who have been following what is going on in Sudan. And he's joining me today as we discuss everything that is unfolding in the country and the role of outside players like the UAE in the fire that is burning in Sudan. Today I have none other than Oscar Ricketts. He's an investigative journalist, and his work has been seen in the BBC, in Middle East Eye, in Vice, and a lot of other places. So I'm going to move the table over to you, Mr. Oscar. Please tell us about yourself and where people can find you.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you very much for having me. I haven't worked at the BBC for a very long time, so I wouldn't want them, to be, they wouldn't want to be, maybe they wouldn't want to be associated with me, maybe I wouldn't want to be associated with them. So I work mostly for Middle East Eye, which your viewers may know as a publication that particularly covers Palestine, but we've been covering Sudan. I mean, the publication's been covering Sudan since it began in 2014, and I've been covering Sudan for them since I started working there, which was about 2018. And I also have worked in the past for The Guardian and for ITN and for Vice, for Open Democracy, and for a long time I've been involved in the Africa Report and Africa Confidential, and Africa Confidential, which comes out every fortnight, is very good if you're looking to sort of cover, if you're looking for the sort of inside story on lots of different parts of the continent, not just on Sudan. Does a lot of good coverage on Nigeria, for example, as well. So yeah, that's me. I'm based in Britain, and I'm still a journalist despite everything.
Okay, let's get into the conversation for today, Sudan.
Yeah.
Now, for most of my life, it seems that Sudan has always been in a state of war, right? Yeah. And even led to the split of the country in 2011, where we had Sudan and South Sudan. So can you just quickly give us a brief history of the conflict in Sudan and what led to the split between Sudan and South Sudan?
Between Sudan and South Sudan. Well, yeah, so you're right to say that this is a country that, certainly in parts of the country, have been at war probably for most of the 21st century. Sudan, of course, formerly a British colony, achieved independence from Britain after the Second World War, and I think that when we talk about the current war, which broke out in 2023, you have to go back to the beginning of the century, to the beginning of the 21st century, and the war that became a genocide in Darfur. And of course, South Sudan is part of that and is linked to that. But I think, and South Sudan has its part to play in the current war. And I know at some point we'll be talking about the United Arab Emirates, and South Sudan, its government under Salva Kiir, has an interesting relationship with the UAE and with the Sudanese armed forces. But I suppose, just to frame the current war, the frame that I would use would not really so much relate to South Sudan. It would be about Darfur. And in the beginning of the century, so as your viewers will know, Omar al-Bashir was an autocrat who ruled Sudan from 1989 to 2019. And he did so with the support of what we might broadly describe as the country's Islamist movement, though we'd have to be a bit more specific, because that word is misused in the Western media to describe lots of quite different groupings. But Bashir was a general, was a military man, and that was that was his kind of political backing. Now, beginning of in Darfur, beginning of the 21st century, you had rebellions among the local population there, and Bashir, to put those rebellions down, Bashir used a collection of militias who came to be known as the Janjaweed militias. Janjaweed sometimes translates as devils on horseback. And these were drawn from nomadic Arab groups, and they included a then young man called Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who we now know as Hemeti, whose family had origins in Chad, but who, as far as we know, was from Darfur. And he was one of the commanders of the Janjaweed. And the Janjaweed later went on to be responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly from different Black African groups from Darfur, particularly the Masalit people. And this, obviously, you'll remember, became an international, it was a bit like sort of Feed the World or something in the 80s. A lot of kind of white people from around the world getting very worked up about what was happening. George Clooney, later on Angelina Jolie. It became like a cause celeb, right? George Bush was very involved, and so eventually it stopped, right? So it achieved a kind of level of prominence that actually the current war in Sudan hasn't really achieved, interestingly. In 2013, Bashir was facing, people often say that the Sudan didn't really have its kind of Arab Spring moment. And that's true in the sense that there wasn't a huge uprising. There wasn't a change of government as there was in Egypt, or in Tunisia. There wasn't then a huge civil war as there was in Syria. We're getting to that now. But Sudan has always had a kind of revolutionary character. This was true under the British, and it has been true throughout Sudan's life as a kind of post-colonial nation. And in 2013, Bashir was facing a kind of a rolling wave of protests, and these protests were often linked to the price of bread or to other austerity measures, or they had been, as they were in Darfur, they had been about the control of the country from what is known there as the kind of riverine elite. So Khartoum, the capital city, sits where two branches of the Nile River meet each other. It sits at the confluence of those two rivers, and the country has always been, not always obviously, but the country's tended to be controlled by an elite that has existed there, that lives there, that has its base there. And that has been to the detriment of people in the far west of the country, in Darfur. And it's important to say here that Darfur is a country Darfur is an area probably the size of France, maybe even bigger. It's quite in parts of it very inhospitable, very hard to get around, mountainous desert regions. It feels far away from anywhere, and certainly it was far away from the center of power. And the same is true in the east of the country on the Red Sea coast. Sudan has about an 850-kilometer stretch of Red Sea coast, which again is very crucial to the war, because it's something that Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and any number of other countries are interested in Turkey, are interested in being involved in. In 2013, Bashir incorporated the Janjaweed militias into a new entity, which he called the Rapid Support Forces. He brought it into the auspices of the state under the umbrella of the intelligence agency. And Hemeti became the key man. And Bashir would pronounce Hemeti's name in Arabic so that it sounded like my protection, right? Hemeti was his protection, right? And that sort of lays the groundwork for what later transpires. The RSF, as we call it, Rapid Support Forces, it then becomes part of the military, and then it's essentially part of the army, or it's connected to the army, to the Sudanese Armed Forces, this kind of grand old institution that was inaugurated under the British. But the RSF, under Hemeti and his brother Abdul Rahim Dagalo and other members of the Dagalo family, becomes its own, very much its own thing, with its own power base, with its own sources of income and its own foreign relationships. We're talking here particularly about gold and particularly about the United Arab Emirates.
Oh,
now,
wow.
I can take the story further forward, but maybe you might, or you know, the question is, where do we want to go from here? Because there's a few different directions.
Okay, I think you can continue because it's getting really interesting.
So the RSF exists under Bashir, right? And Bashir, increasingly, like other autocrats of his era, was under pressure from his people, but also under pressure from other people in power, other military figures. And in the end, a kind of another rebellion breaks out at the end of 2018. And in 2019, this leads to Bashir's. So this is a popular uprising, although again, there's external actors involved. Probably the US is involved. But because it's, again, important to say that Bashir had kind of turned Sudan into a kind of pariah state. Sudan had hosted Osama bin Laden for a period of time in the 1990s. It had sort of, it was bombed by the Americans under Bill Clinton. To the west, it was a pariah. It had a relationship with Iran, which Bashir then broke off in favor of Saudi Arabia. And in 2019, Bashir's time is up, and he is removed from power by two people. One, the chief of the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the other person who removes him, his old protection, Hemeti.
Hemeti, oh.
Right. So Bashir is removed from power. In 2019, ostensibly, you know, because of acting under the will of the people. Now, in 2019, there's a transition. What is termed a transitional government is set up. It has a civilian component and it has a military component, and it's split between the two. And the civilian prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok, and then it has Burhan and Hemeti, and Sudan kind of is then supposedly moving forwards with the idea that it will become a kind of democratic, sort of Western style democratic liberal country. In October 2021, this kind of completely falls apart. Hemeti and Burhan, working together, enact a coup, and they remove the civilian component of the government. But as I've said before, the RSF and the army, they have different sources of power and they have different sources of wealth, and they have different interests and they have different characters. Burhan is a military man trained in Egypt, who has kind of long-standing connections to the Islamist movement in Sudan, is much more of an establishment figure. Hemeti is from the outside. You know, he, you know, has previously been called a warlord. He was illiterate up to a certain point. And the guys that he had around him, you know, the guys that he has around him are they're very different. They're noticeably different people, right? And you know, this was true for anyone who met any of them. But it was true, like this became very clear when, and I'm skipping forward, but it became clear at the beginning of a war when the RSF took control of Khartoum, because there was this clear division and distinction between the people. But in 2021, they're still working together because they have a kind of common enemy, which is essentially democracy, right? They have a common, or you know, the revolution, like again, like Sudan's revolution had been from the grassroots, was powered by a collection of a sort of nationwide network of local activist groups called the resistance committees, the RCs, who is still present in Sudan and who have been responsible for sort of essentially partly responsible for sort of feeding and keeping the population alive during the course of the war. And they run neighborhood kitchens, they run mutual aid groups essentially, that whereby they're, you know, they're trying to facilitate medical care, food and water provision, housing, that kind of thing. Now, in 2021, these guys are, you know, these guys, and then the civilian politicians who had been in the government, they are got rid of. And in that period of time, you know, I was in touch with many activists who were being hunted, really.
Oh.
You know, they were being hunted by the state in different parts of the country. But between 2021 and 2023, you have a breakdown in the relationship between Hemeti and Burhan.
Yeah. Okay.
They're ostensibly working together. Burhan is the de facto head of state. Hemeti is his deputy. But they are meeting different people and they're developing different sources of power, to the point where Burhan could have a meeting with, say, Vladimir Putin, but then Hemeti would go and spend a week in Moscow and meet different people.
In Russia.
Yeah.
Different people. Wow.
Yeah, you know, so, or for example, with Israel, the Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni, well, it was actually Janet Museveni, his wife, brokers a meeting between Burhan and Benjamin Netanyahu, with the prospect of Sudan normalizing its relationship with Israel. But in the meantime, Hemeti is making contacts with Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence.
Yeah.
Right. So they've got these kind of parallel foreign policies. And while the Sudanese army has the military industrial complex of the country, so it has factories, and you know, it kind of controls a lot of the local production. And Hemeti and the Dagalo family have struck gold at a place called Jabal Emer in Darfur, and in other parts of Darfur. Now, there is gold in many different parts of Sudan, but there's a lot of gold in Darfur. And the key relationship in this war, or maybe in this picture anyway, is between the Dagalo family and the Al Nahyan family, the ruling family of the United Arab Emirates. Because the gold that comes out of Darfur is melted, refined, and then sold on the market in Dubai. And
okay, let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Because we'll get into the gold details much later, but that's a good place. So now this breakdown between 2021 and 2023, right? Between Hemeti and al-Bashir, their relationship completely breaks down in 2023.
Yeah.
Right. So what led to the kickoff of the current war going on? What was the reason that they began to shoot at each other?
Right. So so Hemeti and Burhan's relationship breaks down. Why does it break down? The US, Saudi Arabia, and other international actors are trying to get Sudan, or supposedly trying to get Sudan back onto its previous track towards civilian governance. Okay. And a key part of this is, what do we do with the rapid support forces? Right? So, because basically people are looking at the situation and they are saying, we cannot have a country in which there is an army with maybe 200,000 people as part of it, and then a paramilitary with upwards of 100,000 people in it. And bear in mind that this paramilitary, the RSF, it had already sent thousands of fighters to Yemen to fight for the Saudi and UAE backed coalition there. Okay. And it had also already sent fighters to Libya to fight for the UAE's, to fight alongside the UAE's preferred leader, Khalifa Haftar.
And this is after Gaddafi fell?
This is after Gaddafi fell, yeah. So basically, from about 2016, 2017, the RSF is sending mercenaries to fight in the UAE's wars, right? And in 2023 or 2022, 2023, a situation in which the RSF and the army still exist together is seen as being untenable. So as part of the negotiations to try and bring Sudan back towards some kind of civilian government, they are talking about wrapping up the RSF or folding it into the army, making the RSF part of the army. And the question is then, how long would that process take? What would it look like? And there is essentially an intractable disagreement between the parties about what that should be, right? Because you know, some people are saying it should happen immediately, and then, you know, the Tagalos are trying to say, well, it should be 10 years, maybe it should never happen, right? And in the meantime, knowing this, the RSF is positioning itself for a fight, and the army can see that this is happening as well. And then in April 2023, and we still don't know who fired the first shot, but from my sourcing, the RSF launched an attack on the presidential palace in Khartoum. Burhan took up a gun himself to defend himself, and then escaped, possibly into a network of underground tunnels underneath the presidential palace. But it was essentially the prospect of the RSF ending that caused the war. Lots of things caused the war, but that was the kind of thing that kicks it all off. And that was April 2023, and it's been going on ever since.
Wow. Interesting. And why this situation in Sudan is really, I find it very, it touches me, because of the human casualties that has erupted as a result of this. But now you briefly touched about the relationship between Hemeti and the UAE, where you mentioned gold. But I want you to shed more light on the relationship other than giving fighters to Libya, UAE-backed forces in Libya and also Yemen. Just touch on more the relationship between Hemeti and the UAE.
Yeah, so Hemeti in the months leading up to the war in 2023, Hemeti takes a very long trip to the UAE. He's there, I think, for about 2 weeks, and he meets with Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the ruler of the United Arab Emirates, and he meets with one of his deputies, Sheikh Mansour, who is probably best known as the owner of Manchester City Football Club, but who is a key figure in the UAE's foreign policy and is a key figure in its involvement in Sudan. The relationship between the Dagalo family and the UAE, it goes back a long way before the war, and it is characterized, or its key components include, as I've said, the provision of mercenaries for UAE-backed wars in Yemen and in Libya, and the smuggling of gold. And in return, what the RSF get, what the Dagalo family get, is weapons and other logistical support. So, you know, we know from recovered documents from battlefield documents recovered on the battlefield that Emirati officers have been on the ground in this war. So they've been taking part, that they are actually taking part in this war. We know that and throughout the war there has been evidence and sourcing, and I've reported it, but it's been reported elsewhere, and it's been cited by the United Nations and other international bodies. The weight of, though the UAE continues to deny it, the weight of evidence for the UAE's involvement, for its support of the RSF, is, I mean, it's sort of undeniable, right? And this happens through a network of different actors in the region, and they include the Haftar family, Khalifa Haftar, who is the former CIA asset turned Libyan strongman who is in control of eastern Libya. And there is an air base called Kufra in southeastern Libya, which is crucial to the supply of the RSF in Sudan. And a recent development in the war is that in June, the RSF took control of the Sudanese portion of the triangle border region that straddles Libya, Egypt, and Sudan. And this is a kind of wild, previously very porous place, which is almost entirely desert. It's inhospitable. It's on the Mediterranean migrant route. So migrants, refugees coming from other parts of Africa, if they're trying to get to the Mediterranean, they usually have to go through this part of the world. And before the war, the European Union was paying money to Sudan, which was going to the RSF to stop people from getting to the Mediterranean, and doing quite unpleasant things to them on the way up. And it's also key for gold, because there's gold there, and gold is easily smuggled across the border. How does this relate to the UAE? The UAE, it also has kind of involved actors in Chad. Now, at the beginning of the war, the government in N'Djamena was actually very concerned. The beginning of the war in Sudan in 2023, the government in Chad was very concerned that the fighting would spill across the border from Darfur into Chad. Chad shares a very long border with Darfur. And there was also concern because Hemeti, who has a cousin who is a Chadian general, there was a concern from the Déby government in Chad that the RSF would look to enact regime change in Chad, right? Because he was seen as being kind of hostile to the government.
Yeah.
And what happened was, you know, according to multiple sources, what happened was that a delegation from the United Arab Emirates turned up and said to the Chadian government, here's a lot of money, why don't you change sides? And now and then after that, you then have the rapid development and establishment of like field hospitals in a place called Amjaras, which is where the Déby family originally comes from, and then other kind of which again intelligence reports and satellite imagery show have been places where RSF fighters receive medical attention, but also it's where weapons are flown into, and there's been drone instruction going on there. And it has become essentially a UAE-backed outpost for the RSF.
Support for the RSF.
And you have similar relationships in the Central African Republic, in South Sudan, and in Uganda. And in Uganda, you have a situation in which some of the weapons, some of the gold that comes out of Darfur from mines controlled by the Dagalo family goes to Entebbe or to an air base called Kachansi, which is near there, and then it's flown on to the United Arab Emirates. But Museveni, again, like many many different governments in the region, has an increasingly close or beholden relationship to the UAE. The UAE is, as somebody in Dubai once said, it's richer than God, and it is buying up the loyalty and the cooperation of governments, including Kenya's, including Uganda's, including Chad's, including Haftar in Libya. It is, you know, somebody said to me recently, if you want to know what the UAE is doing in Africa, look at what the East India Company did in India. Look at how the British got into India.
Because that's one of the questions that I want to ask, because each time I see the UAE's activities on the continent, just like we're talking about right now in Sudan, we also see in Kenya and a lot of places, and I believe they even have something like UAE AID, like US AID. They also have something like that. So I keep wondering, what do they want? So I'm putting that question to you because I don't have the answer. What is the UAE's grand goal in Africa? Why are they doing this?
It's a good question. I mean, we should say, of course, for the purposes of fairness, that, you know, they are doing some humanitarian work. They are providing aid. It's not, and they're not the only external actor. And again, I'll say this for the purposes of fairness: Turkey now has drone operators inside Sudan working for the Sudanese armed forces. So there's a developing proxy war, and it's increasingly a drone war, by the way, between Turkey and the UAE inside Sudan, just as there was in Libya. Egypt, traditionally, Egypt is an ally of the UAE and depends on it financially, but it supports the Sudanese armed forces. And it is also, Egypt is also taking a lot of gold from Sudan, which comes from areas controlled by the Sudanese army. So it's not, gold is, it's not just that gold is going from RSF territory in Sudan to the UAE, it's also going from army held territory into Egypt and then often onto the UAE, right? Because the UAE is the gold market. I mean, in terms of Africa as a whole, 400 tons of smuggled gold worth about $30 billion leaves Africa to go to the UAE every year.
Wow.
And it's melted, refined, and sold on the market in Dubai, at which point it becomes legal. Right? Now, what is the UAE doing in Africa? So, you know, the UAE has been a state, has been an entity since the early 1970s. It was previously called the Trucial States. It was a British protectorate. It was sort of established almost by the British to kind of serve British imperial interests in that part of the world. Prior to the discovery of oil, so oil was discovered in Dubai in 1966. At that point, Dubai was a small, dusty town of about 30,000 people. I mean, people who went to Dubai in those days talk about this kind of magical place in the middle of the desert, barely anything there. And at the end of this year, I think Dubai will probably have a population of about 4 million. And Dubai, of course, has become this, the sort of almost like a kind of a symbol of late capitalism. These gleaming towers, you know, and Doha is the same. And it's not just the UAE, but it's gone from being a place where the local industry was pearl diving. You know, that was what people did. You know, they got pearls off the seabed floor. You know, to being a kind of initially powered by oil. And I think that's probably part of the story, because the kind of petrochemical era is, well, I mean, maybe we'd like to think that it's coming to an end. You know, the UAE, just like Saudi Arabia, just like Qatar, is looking to solidify its influence and position in a world in which the control of petrochemicals is becoming becoming marginally less important. The UAE, but also very, very particularly, the UAE is a kingdom ruled by a ruling family. It's an autocracy, and the Al Nahyan family, again, like other families in different parts of the world, but you know, particularly next door in Saudi Arabia, for example, like any ruling system, and it's the same here in Britain, like any ruling system, it wants to perpetuate itself. It wants to keep going. It wants to remain in control. And it does that by suppressing political opposition at home and building networks of control outside of the country. And what it's particularly interested in Africa is gold, agricultural land. So it's bought up vast swathes of agricultural land.
Yeah, I noticed that in one of your reports. I read it. Yeah.
And in Sudan, it's part of that as well. It's also interested, as lots of other countries are, including Russia, in a port on the Red Sea coast. The DP World is one of the big Emirati companies, a port company, and they want some involvement, or they want more involvement, because they are already involved in somewhere on the port, on the coast of Sudan. So it's kind of it's to do with resources, but it's also to do with politics, because in the biggest threat probably to the UAE is political Islam, because that is how that has been. I mean, that's not the only current. The Arab Spring brought together diffuse political energies, secular leftist energies, but it was also in Egypt, for example, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that won the post Mubarak elections. In Tunisia, it was the Ennahda party. So there is a great fear in the UAE of democratic Muslim political organizations, and in Sudan, they see the Sudanese army as being more aligned with those forces, because the Sudanese army has a kind of like a through line to the era of Bashir and to the political Islamic movement in Sudan. So that to them is their concern. And groups like the RSF, they create chaos, and chaos is something that the UAE can work with. And chaos is something that it thrives on, because it means, for example, that it can profit immensely from the economy of war. And it's not the only side profiting from a war economy. The Sudanese army, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, they are also profiting from a war. But it's the most important external actor. Yeah.
Interesting. But outside of Africa, does the UAE play this kind of games in any other continent?
It's a good question. Because
to the best of my knowledge, it's just here.
Yeah, I think I'm sure that it has. I mean, for example, in Pakistan, for a long time, most of the madrasas be funded by the Saudis. Whether the UAE is involved in any of the other, whether it's got any involvement in Indonesia or in Pakistan, I don't know. It would tend to be ideologically opposed to the kind of dominant movements in most places. No, I think it's mainly interest. I mean, as far as I know, the interest is mainly in Africa. Geographically, that makes sense. It's just across the Red Sea, and it also, Africa. To speak incredibly generally, but obviously, as you know from Nigeria, the kind of like colonialism never ended, right? And of course in Nigeria, that's been large Western oil companies, the Brits still involved, the Americans still involved, and then the becoming of the Chinese later on, maybe. But with of course with the enthusiastic cooperation of local elites. Yeah, for and the vast expropriation of wealth, far more money being drained from Africa than has ever gone back into it. And I think the UAE just sort of following again. I mentioned the sort of British playbook in India. I think it's just sort of it's it's just another scramble for Africa again, you know. And they have the money to make it work, you know. And that's you know, William Ruto in Kenya, his former deputy president said, you know, when Hemeti came, this was a while ago, when Hemeti came to meet Ruto, the former deputy prime minister said, well, there was a point when I just had to leave the room because they were going to have a private conversation.
Like, and is that the reason why they kicked him out of office? Because the way he got out of office was very suspicious.
You know, it's like, and I think these in a sort of, with every country kind of folded into the global capitalist system, with every country struggling, when any country sort of tries to sort of do something different to that, it's, you know, it's a bit like the line in The Godfather Part 3, just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. You can't, you know, when the UAE comes to you with the resources it has, I think it's quite hard to say no, you know, when you're looking at a kind of, when, you know, if I'm maybe trying to be too, being too understanding of people like Museveni or Ruto or whoever. Of course I am. But at the same time, if you're looking at a kind of huge, if you're looking at a growing population, large, young, growing population, then you think, oh, maybe this is a shortcut. Maybe this is a shortcut to something.
But that's, to me, that's the, pardon my language, but that's the stupidity of that policy.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Because the complaint now is, oh, because of neocolonialism, things we can't get done, Africa is broke, right? The leaders, the way the global economic system is set up, it doesn't favor Africa. And we have said the problem with that is the structures of neocolonialism, right? So you now dancing to the tune of the UAE, just continues that same cycle. Yeah. So it doesn't fix, because one of the things I wanted to ask, okay, now we saw the UAE, what is looking for its resources in Africa, is looking for power to assert itself to its own degree in geopolitics. So it's looking for power, it's looking for leverage. But then I look at the African countries and the leaders who are playing along to this thing. What is in it for you or for your country?
Well, there's not much in it for the country, but there's quite a lot in it for their own personal bank balances. I mean, of course, the other crucial thing here is, as I've said before, fighters. But this, just to put this into the kind of context, you've got to put it into an African or to a trans-Sahel kind of context. You have a huge number of young unemployed men who don't have anything, and they don't have anything to do. And somebody comes to them and says, here's a gun, here's a few $100s a month, maybe more. That's it. You know, that's you know, this is how it sort of, you know, this is how it draws in all these different people. Terrible for all the different countries. It isn't in anyone's interest except probably the ruling family and the elite around it in the UAE. And of course, remember that the UAE is a crucial US and British ally. I mean, the relationship between the Brits and the UAE is very bad, but the UAE is a crucial ally for the Brits. I mean, this is the thing. Like, there's a very bad level of trust between the two. But Britain again has made itself dependent on investment and money from UAE. Not just the UAE, but you know, from from the UAE. And again, this is because of a sort of refusal, a refusal to do anything different with the economy, you know.
Because I see that, speaking of Britain, I see that a lot of golf money is in Britain,
Yeah.
from your football clubs to even Harrods
Yeah.
and several other investment. Like, okay, let's. Each time I try to wrap my head around this, it just doesn't make sense. And I think that this global order is not sustainable.
No, I don't think
Not
so either.
sustainable, because a report came out. I saw that some weeks ago, that globally, I think about 60 or 70% of wealth is now held in the hands of just a handful of people. This thing is not sustainable. So, but the African leaders, which is my annoyance though, the African leaders who are playing a role in perpetuating this system that you're complaining about, it's just going to still come back to bite you. But that's me ranting. Now that
I think it's important to understand that we all live in one country, and that country is called capitalism.
yeah,
And this means that in different ways, we can see these same dynamics wherever we are. Now, of course, in a country like Sudan, it's at the brutal end of it, because it is mired in war. You know, and just to say something about the humanitarian effect on it, over 12 million people have had to flee their homes, which is something like a third of the population. We don't have any official death mortality figures, but the heads of different aid agencies have told me they think it's over 200,000. Just extraordinarily awful reports of sexual violence, including the rape of children as young as 1. Just I think maybe in El Fasher now, which is the capital of North Darfur, which has been under famine conditions since last year. You have a situation there that is probably almost as bad as the situation in Gaza right now. And I mean, it's of course in Sudan, the problem for the people of Gaza, the problem is the kind of green light, the endless assistance that Israel is given by its Western allies. And the problem in Sudan probably is a lack of interest. But also a green light given to the UAE. You know, I wouldn't put it on the same level as Israel, but I would say that the UAE, like Israel, is seen as being useful for the West, and therefore it gets to do what it wants.
But isn't, like, I'm thinking now that United States, right, and these Western countries, they always scream about human rights. And they say it's part of the rules-based international order.
Yeah.
So you would expect that what is going on in Sudan, like I would have expected before now, what's going on in Sudan they would have called UAE to order, because the UAE and America are really good allies. Do you get? But if they haven't done anything about Gaza, that is taking the headlines day after day, I don't think that anyone is going to look Africa's way.
Yeah.
I really don't think so.
Yeah, I think that's right, Amanda. I think that at different points we've seen. So I think, you know, there are a few American politicians who are genuinely interested in Sudan and who have tried to put pressure on the UAE. I think there was an interesting split in American foreign policy between the Near East Bureau of the State Department and the Africa Bureau of the State Department. I think the Africa people in the US government were very strongly pushing for the UAE to be, you know, to be sort of brought to heel a little bit. But the Near East people, they don't want that, because the UAE remains a kind of crucial, and this was true under Biden as well, right? This is a policy that transfers over. the UAE is seen as being, because it normalized its relations with Israel, because it's essentially, it doesn't really care about the Palestinians. It is seen as being, you know, it's crucial to the Americans. They outsource a lot of their policy in the region to the Emiratis, and so while there were previously elements of the US government who wanted to do something about the UAE, they never had the upper hand, right? And certainly under Trump, it's very hard to see them having the upper hand, because I think I'd be surprised if Trump has ever thought about Sudan. Like, the only thing that might happen is that it might be folded into a wider deal as part of a region. Like, both sides of now, of course, everyone in Sudan is expecting some kind of American intervention at some point, and so it's partly why you've seen a lot of fighting recently. So the situation on the battlefield right now is that the RSF holds almost all of Darfur. The army in the west, the army has most of the rest of the country, including Khartoum, the capital, which it took back off the RSF. And then in Kordofan, which is a kind of region essentially between the two, you have very fierce fighting at the moment. And then in the meantime, there are drone strikes going back and forward. The UAE is supplying the RSF with Chinese-made drones, which are regularly striking Port Sudan, which is currently the de facto capital of the country. So that's sort of what's happening on the battlefield, and the fighting in Kordofan is a key area because it's between Khartoum and Darfur. If the army wins in Kordofan, then it might try and invade Darfur. But the other thing that we've reported on is the prospect of Sudan splitting again. So we had South Sudan, and then there is the prospect that Sudan will split, but that Darfur will essentially become its own country under the RSF. I was speaking to someone in El Geneina, which is in Darfur, which is held by the RSF. And he was saying, you know, it's weird that there is sort of ordinary life right now. You know, he was saying the other day, I discovered that there's avocados in the market, and we were all kind of astonished.
Wow.
So it's, yeah, I mean, so there's the prospect of some kind of American intervention, but it hasn't arrived yet. And given the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Gaza, it is hard to see anything happening too quickly.
Yeah, and considering that Israel just struck Qatar, that was yesterday.
Yeah,
it's just going to escalate what's going on in the Middle East, so they're not likely to look over here. Now, we've spoken about the United States, the UAE, several African countries. I want us to talk about Russia, because Russia also, I have seen several news reports about Russia and Sudan. So please just shed some light about Russia's relationship and Russia's position in this conflict.
So when the war broke out, the Wagner, the Russian the former Russian paramilitary group, which was still under at that time controlled by Prigozhin, who obviously, you know, died in suspicious circumstances. So when the war broke out in Sudan, the Wagner group was working with the UAE and the RSF. Wagner was present in the country, and it was involved in the smuggling of gold, and the gold would sometimes go through Russian-controlled air bases in Syria, because of course this was before the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and gold would come out of Sudan and feed the Russian war effort in Ukraine, right? So this was because Russia was looking for ways to fund this war that it began in February 2022. So that was the kind of state of play at the beginning of the war in Sudan. By the end of 2023, Wagner is no longer in Sudan. Okay, so Wagner is not present anymore. And then what happens is the Russian government, rather than any rather than Wagner or Africa Corps, which is what has kind of replaced it. The Russian government, directly under Vladimir Putin, began to move towards a position in which it was helping the Sudanese armed forces, while I mean there was a kind of playing both sides element, which is not unusual in any foreign policy, but certainly not in Russian foreign policy. But definitely there was material help from the Russians for the Sudanese armed forces, possibly just in terms of fuel, but I think maybe there was weapons involved as well. And Russia's kind of long-term strategic goal has, like other countries, been to establish some kind of base on the Red Sea, and that's
the ports of Sudan.
Yeah, it has an interest in that, long-standing interest in that, and you know, in the month or two before the war, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, had been in Sudan, as had high-level delegations from the US, from Europe, and from Israel. So there was a lot of interest in Sudan, a lot of sort of geostrategic kind of playing, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, now you have a situation where Russia kind of, you know, I think it's sort of it's not hugely important in Sudan, I don't think, but it's you know, it's involved, you know, and if it can kind of extract some kind of an advantage, then I think it will. But you know, there was certainly a period of time when there was a lot of reporting about Russian involvement in different places, but didn't quite add up. There's also possibly been Ukrainian special forces involved on the side of the Sudanese army. And earlier in the war, Ukrainian President Zelensky met Burhan in Ireland at a US airbase there. So interesting things have happened there as well. And I think there is an argument that the involvement of the Ukrainians alongside the Sudanese army prompted Russia to kind of step up its engagement with the Sudanese army.
Okay, another question I want to ask is, sometime after Israel's war in Gaza kicked off in 2023, there were there's this particular video, I do not remember the person's name now, but you may remember the person's name when I mentioned the story, where he spoke about, it was someone, a top official in the US government, he spoke about the plan to break up 7 countries in the space of 5 years. And among the 7 countries, there was Syria, there was Somalia, there was Iran, there was Libya, there was, in fact, every country that the United States has been involved in militarily in the Middle East, it was there. And the plan was to break them up in 5 years. And I believe out of these 7 countries, the only one left standing is Iran, and they are losing their heads over Iran. But I want to bring this to Sudan, because Sudan was one of the countries that was mentioned in this. And we saw the breakup of Sudan in 2011. So now that Sudan has broken up, I just wanted to ask, do we still see hands of Israel and United States involved in what is going on in Sudan currently?
I think I've heard, it's interesting. I think that I mean, funnily enough, the kind of what we consider to be what was a kind of democratic uprising in 2018, 2019, that may have had some American involvement. Like there may have been, or at least encouragement. Now, this is something that I've never pinned down exactly, but it's something that has been suggested to me by people who know, which is not to say that it wasn't a it wasn't a true popular revolution. I think it was. But it's definitely true to say that Bashir was not a friend of the Americans,
Okay.
and that the Americans didn't, that the Americans didn't want Bashir in power. And it's one of those situations where probably it's not like a situation you have it's not the same. I don't think it's the same as the sort of history of the late 20th century and more recently is full of countries where you have popular governments who the Americans bring down because they don't like them, or because they were communist, or like so. And Iran, of course, is a great example of that in '53. Obviously, the killing of Patrice Lumumba. I mean, again, as you all know better than me, it's just this happened across Africa, and we probably know it best in Pinochet in Chile, in Argentina with Galtieri. I mean, the killing of maybe 1 million people in Indonesia, backed by the CIA, or the Vietnam War, for God's sake. Like all of these this history of American desecration, anti-popular, anti-communist desecration. In Sudan, I think you have a situation where maybe the will of the wishes of the people, the will of the people aligned with American geostrategic interests. And that's probably how that may be how we might consider Syria to be similar, but that would prompt a lot of arguments, so we won't go there. But I think the Sudanese people did not want Bashir in power anymore, but I think the Americans probably didn't want him in power anymore either. So they may have helped the process on a little bit, but the problem was they couldn't control the process afterwards.
Yeah.
And they have now more or less abdicated the scene. And it's not. I mean, but and again, there's this tension in the Trump world. There's obviously this tension between a lot of his supporters and people like Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, who are like, we shouldn't be involved in anywhere. What are we doing with the Israelis? What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And then the sort of, the more old-fashioned. I mean, the killing of these Venezuelans on the very flimsy pretext that they're drug dealers. I mean, again, this is bad. This is just sort of very crude, old-fashioned American kind of regime change stuff, which they may have considered, obviously, with Iran as well. But yeah, in Sudan, I think it's difficult, because I think I wouldn't want to kind of downplay the significance and the kind of realness of the Sudanese revolution. It's a real thing. I think the Americans were looking to control it, maybe, but I think, with Israel, I think Israel was looking. I mean, the prior to Gaza, the Netanyahu, one of the sort of Netanyahu plans was essentially you isolate the Palestinians by doing all of these through the Abraham Accords, through normalizing with all the Arab countries, and therefore you leave the Palestinians isolated.
So is that, sorry for cutting you short, is that the reason why, because sometime last year, I believe towards the ending of last year, I saw a report of a military base that is planned for Somaliland to be constructed and funded by the UAE. But
yes, that's already happened. So the UAE is using Bosaso. So the UAE is using Bosaso as a key base, and again earlier, and I should have mentioned it earlier because earlier I talked about, you know, there is the UAE, there is a reason it has bases just surrounding Sudan. And Bosaso is now one of those bases, and the UAE is involved in the internal politics of Somalia / Somaliland / Puntland.
Yeah.
So and is kind of looking to sort of carve it up in its own interest there.
How can such a small country be able to stretch its hand because you expect it first thing from like a large country like Russia or the United States or China, but the UAE is just too tiny anyway.
Yeah.
Britain is a very small country and it did a lot.
But you're right, not as small as the UAE. You know, and Britain, I suppose, was quite conveniently positioned geographically, but yeah, I mean, again, of course, you know, how did a group as small as the original East India Company group go and then begin the control of what was then possibly the world's largest economy? I mean, you know, Mughal India was not was a huge and hugely significant place, and it is strange. I mean, I think, you know, through a kind of combination of ruthlessness, single-mindedness, and just, I mean, you know, a will to do it is, I mean, I'm speaking about Britain here, but I could be speaking about the UAE as well. And of course, what the UAE now has is just more money than anyone else.
A lot of money.
You know, and a desire to use that money in this way. You know, the Norwegians have lots of money, but they're not using it to do this. You know, yeah.
And so earlier this year, I read that Sudan, that's the armed forces, Sudan itself, sent a genocide case to the ICJ against the UAE, but then it was thrown out. Can you just shed some light on it as we plan to round up?
So the government of Sudan is currently controlled by the army, or it's led by the army, right? So it's a kind of like, it's a sort of de facto government, and they brought this case against the United Arab Emirates. The RSF in Darfur, the RSF has been sanctioned by the US the United States has determined that the RSF is committing genocide in Darfur, that it's committing genocide against the non-Arab population there. You know, there's a kind of, you know, ethnically Sudanese people are lots of different things, and lots of, you know, and they might be Arab and something, you know, but so it's I don't want to make this too particularly about ethnicity, but obviously there's the RSF and its kind of allied militias tend to be from one particular group, and then you have the Masalit people, the Zagawa people, who are the kind of Black African population of that part of the world, right? And it's been a number of human rights groups also have followed the US or have preceded the US in saying that the RSF is committing genocide. The Sudanese government looked to tie the UAE to that. I think that they probably, I think that the problem for them is that they are, the Sudanese armed forces has also committed war crimes in this war. They therefore don't count as a kind of, they're not a neutral party in it. So the case against Israel has been brought by South Africa. But you know, but if a Palestinian group had brought this case, I think it would have been knocked out as well. So I think like I think the decision as far as I can see was understandable.
Okay. Oscar, thank you so much. I took a little bit more time than I actually planned to take because this case in Sudan has been very important to me and my audience. But thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully I can have you sometime again to discuss more about this. Thank you. Do you have any last thing you want to say?
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay then. Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you so much. And we'll be coming back next week. And next week we'll be discussing I'll be going deeper into the just concluded Shanghai Cooperation, the SEO that took place last week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.